In 1944, German prisoners of war were transported across the United States. What they saw through the train windows was not what they expected. Endless factories, smoke rising day and night, entire cities built for production. Some of them fell silent. Others started whispering. And a few had to be calmed down by guards because, in that moment, they realized something terrifying. Germany was not just losing the war, it had already lost it. The rifle fell from Hans Brenner's hands before he fully understood what had happened. One moment he was crouched behind the crumbling stone wall of a Tunisian farmhouse, the desert air thick with cordite and dust, the sun hammering down on the Afrika Korps like a punishment from God. The next, shadows moved through the smoke. American soldiers, rifles leveled, voices barking in that strange, flat English he had only ever heard in distorted radio broadcasts. He raised his hands. Around him, one by one, his comrades did the same. 23 men who had crossed half of Europe and all of North Africa were surrendering in a country none of them could have found on a map 3 years earlier. It was May 1943. The Afrika Korps was finished. More than 275,000 Axis soldiers would lay down their weapons in Tunisia in the span of just 2 weeks, the largest mass surrender in the history of German arms. For these men, the war was over, but the journey was only beginning. They marched them through the dust first, long columns of field gray uniforms moving through the Tunisian heat, under the watchful eyes of American MPs, who looked, to many of the Germans, disconcertingly young. That was the first thing Hans noticed. How young they were. Boys, really. Corn-fed farm boys from Iowa and Georgia, chewing gum, holding their rifles loosely, almost casually. He had been told to expect this, in a way. The Americans were soft, undisciplined. A nation of immigrants and capitalists, more interested in Hollywood movies and cheeseburgers than in the serious business of war. The propaganda ministry had been very thorough on this point. Hans thought of the newsreels he had watched in Munich cinemas before the war. American streets, American cars, American jazz music drifting from glittering clubs. Degenerate, the narrators called it. A nation without roots, without blood, without the iron will that forges true soldiers. The Americans had been neutral for 2 years while Germany reshaped the world. That told you everything, didn't it? They were reluctant warriors at best, dragged into the conflict only because a Japanese admiral had miscalculated in the Pacific. They would fold under pressure. Everyone said so. Hans watched one of the American guards offer a cigarette to a wounded German sergeant and wondered, for the first time, whether he had miscalculated something himself. The processing camps were chaotic, but not cruel. That surprised almost everyone. Sergeant Wilhelm Kessler, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had transferred to North Africa after being wounded outside Kharkov, had prepared himself for the worst. He had heard stories whispered in foxholes, passed between veterans, about how the Soviets treated prisoners. Frozen labor camps, deliberate starvation, casual executions. He assumed, with a certain grim logic, that the Americans would behave similarly. That was what conquerors did. Instead, they handed him a tin of sea rations and pointed him toward a tent. He sat in the dirt and ate cold beans from a can, while American soldiers 100 meters away played cards and laughed about something he could not understand. He turned the empty tin over in his hands. The label was colorful, printed in crisp, clean typography. It was unsettling in a way he could not quite articulate. This country that turned everything, even military rations, into something that seemed designed to be desired. Around him, his fellow prisoners talked in low voices, processing what had happened. The conversations followed predictable patterns. There was denial first. This is temporary. The war will turn. Rommel will come back. Then the bargaining, the theorizing, the need to construct a narrative that preserved some dignity. A corporal named Fritz claimed loudly that they had been betrayed by Italian cowardice, that the Afrika Korps itself was undefeated. Several men nodded vigorously. It was easier than the alternative. But there were quieter men too, men who sat apart and stared at the American camp with something close to genuine curiosity. Men who had perhaps never been entirely convinced the ships were enormous. When they told the prisoners they were being transported to the United States, not to England, not to some North African holding facility, but to America itself, the reaction was a strange mixture of fear and fascination. America was not an abstraction to these men. It was a myth, a place that existed in the imagination as a series of contradictions. Terrifyingly powerful in industry, laughably weak in spirit, impossibly rich yet morally bankrupt. A land of freedom, as their captors insisted, that had enslaved millions of African people and still called itself the greatest democracy on earth. The propaganda ministry had given them a schizophrenic image of America, simultaneously mocking it and warning against it. And that, really, left most German soldiers genuinely uncertain what to expect. Hans stood on the deck of the transport ship as the North African coastline receded and tried to remember everything he had ever heard about the United States. His uncle had immigrated to Chicago in 1923. He sent letters sometimes before the war. He described enormous buildings, streets so wide you could lose yourself in them. People from every country on earth crowded together in an improbable, chaotic, somehow functioning whole. Those letters had confused Hans. It did not sound like the America of the newsreels. It did not sound weak. He had never mentioned his uncle's letters to anyone. The Atlantic crossing took weeks, and it changed men in ways they did not entirely recognize until later. The ships moved in convoy, protected by destroyer escorts whose wakes cut white lines across gray water. Below decks, hundreds of prisoners were crowded into converted cargo holds. Not comfortable, exactly, but not the degrading conditions many had feared. American guards moved through the holds periodically, checking on things. There was food twice daily. A doctor came when men were sick. Conversations deepened in the enforced intimacy of the crossing. Men who had never spoken honestly about the war began, slowly, to speak honestly about the war. The Eastern Front veterans were the hardest to read. They had seen things that had fundamentally altered them, things that could not easily be translated into the language of normal human experience. Kessler rarely spoke about Kharkov, but sometimes at night, when the ship groaned through heavy swells and the lights were low, he would stare at the ceiling of the hold and his lips would move silently, as if rehearsing something he was not yet ready to say aloud. The younger men, the ones who had been captured in their first or second year of service, argued more freely about Hitler's decisions, about Stalingrad, about whether Germany could still win. A 19-year-old named Peter Hoffmann from Heidelberg, who had been a university student before his conscription, said one evening with quiet clarity, "We were told America was decadent, but a decadent nation does not build ships like this." No one argued with him. The silence that followed was more eloquent than agreement. The first sight of the American coastline came on a morning of pale winter light. Hans was on deck. Prisoners were allowed brief periods of fresh air during daylight. The continent materialized out of the gray Atlantic haze. He had expected something dramatic. What he saw was simply land, flat, green, unremarkable at the distance they were traveling. A coastline like any other coastline. And then, gradually, the scale of it became clear. There were cranes on the horizon, warehouses, tankers moving in and out of harbor, a city assembling itself in the distance, buildings stacking up against the sky in the particular geometry of American ambition. And everywhere, moving across the water and through the air and along the docks, there was the evidence of production. America in 1943 was the greatest manufacturing engine in human history. Fully mobilized, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You could feel it from the water, a kind of low, constant hum of industrial energy that seemed to rise from the continent itself. Hans thought of something his unit commander had said in the Libyan desert months before they were captured. A man who had fought in France, Poland, and Russia. A hard, unsentimental officer who chose his words carefully. He had looked west toward the distant horizon and said, "If the Americans ever fully wake up, God help us all." Standing at the railing of a transport ship, watching the American coastline grow larger, Hans Briner finally understood what he had meant. The propaganda had told them America was weak. The propaganda had been wrong. And somewhere in the gap between those two facts, between what they had been told and what they were now seeing with their own eyes, the first hairline fractures began to appear in everything they thought they knew. They had been captured. They had crossed the ocean, and the country waiting for them on the other side was nothing like the country they had been taught to dismiss. The ship moved steadily toward port. No one spoke. Nobody warned them about the trains. After the ship docked, after the strange, hushed procession down the gangway past the stone-faced MPs and harbor workers who barely glanced up from their tasks, they were loaded onto trains. Long trains with green-painted passenger cars that smelled of machine oil and upholstery, sitting on tracks that seemed to stretch in every direction like the threads of some impossibly vast web. Hans had ridden trains all his life. Germany had the finest rail network in Europe. He thought he understood what trains were. He did not understand these trains. The cars were cleaner than anything he had ridden in since 1939, when the war had begun to grind everything in Germany down toward utility, and then below utility toward something that could only be called endurance. The seats had cushions. There were windows that actually opened. An American soldier walked through periodically with a cart carrying paper cups of coffee and packaged sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Hans accepted a cup and held it in both hands, staring at it. The coffee was weak by German standards, thin and pale, but it was hot, and there was more of it than anyone needed. Kessler sat across from him, looking out the window as the harbor slid past. His face was unreadable, as it usually was, but his eyes were moving, cataloging, measuring, calculating in the way a veteran's eyes always moved. The instinct for tactical assessment never fully switched off, even when there was nothing left to assess. "Where are they taking us?" someone asked from the back of the car. No one answered, because no one knew. The answer revealed itself slowly in the language of landscape. For the first hour, the train moved through coastal flatlands, marshes, scrubby trees, small towns with white-painted churches and gas stations and diners beside the road with neon signs dark in the morning light. It looked, in an almost disorienting way, peaceful, ordinary, like a country that had not noticed a war was happening anywhere on earth. Children stood at road crossings and watched the train pass. A farmer looked up from a field. A woman hung laundry on a line behind a yellow house, and the white sheets moved in the October wind. Hans thought, involuntarily, of his mother's house in Munich, which had been partially destroyed in an air raid 8 months earlier. He looked away from the woman with the laundry. Then the landscape changed. It happened gradually at first. A factory here, a rail yard there, a warehouse district stretching back from the tracks with trucks moving in and out of loading docks. Then more factories. Then more. Then, as the train curved northward and the sky ahead began to change color from blue to gray to a deep industrial amber, They entered the zone that would alter the understanding of every man in those train cars more profoundly than anything that had happened since their capture. The American industrial heartland. The smoke appeared first. Not the thin domestic smoke of chimneys or the acrid black smoke of a battlefield. A permanent structural haze that sat above the horizon like a second sky, dense and orange-gray, shot through with the vertical columns of a dozen stacks rising from a complex of steel mills that stretched along the river for what appeared to be miles. Hans pressed his face to the window. Beside him, he heard Peter Hoffmann draw a sharp breath. The mills were operating. That was the thing that hit you first. Not the size, though the size was staggering, but the fact that they were running fully, completely, without pause. Furnaces glowed orange through open bay doors the size of cathedral entrances. Cranes moved overhead on their tracks with mechanical certainty, carrying loads that would have required entire construction crews in a European context. Sparks cascaded from somewhere deep inside the complex, falling in long, lazy arcs against the gray sky, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. And over everything, so loud it penetrated the sealed windows of the train car and settled into the chest as a physical sensation, was the noise, the deep, rhythmic, pile-driving percussion of a steel industry running at wartime capacity 24 hours a day, without rest, without interruption, as reliably as weather. No one spoke in the train car. Hans had grown up near Munich, where there were factories, where German industry was a point of national pride, where school children were taken on tours of manufacturing plants and told that Germany's industrial might was the foundation of its destiny. He had believed this. He had seen Krupp's output figures in newspapers. He had watched documentary films about the Ruhr Valley. He had understood, intellectually, that Germany was an industrial power. But intellectual understanding and the view from a train window are two different categories of knowledge. What he was seeing now was not a factory. It was not even a complex of factories. It was a system, a living, breathing, self-sustaining industrial ecosystem operating on a scale his previous frame of reference simply could not accommodate. The steel mills gave way to rolling mills. The rolling mills gave way to fabrication plants. Those gave way to warehouses full of finished material. Then, more mills. The whole apparatus was threaded together by rail lines and roads and the constant movement of trucks whose headlights were already on in the mid-afternoon murk of the industrial haze. "This is one city," Peter said softly, not quite to anyone. But really, what they were beginning to understand was even worse than that. Or, more precisely, even larger. It got worse. Or more precisely, it got larger as the day went on. The train moved through cities that seemed to accumulate rather than end, each one flowing into the next, through corridors of rail yards and refineries and chemical plants whose names were stenciled on enormous tanks in letters large enough to read from a moving train. The refineries were the most alien of all. A science fiction landscape of pipes and towers and spherical storage tanks, and the blue-orange flame of gas flares burning off excess at the top of tall stacks, visible for miles, like signals from some civilization operating on principles that had nothing to do with the civilization Hans thought he knew. Kessler leaned forward at one point, watching a convoy of trucks on a parallel road. He counted them under his breath. He got to 40 before the road curved away and they were lost to view. 40 trucks, he said, on one road, at one moment. He did not explain what he meant. He did not need to. Every man in the car was an experienced soldier. They understood logistics. They understood what it meant to move material from one place to another at scale, and how many things had to work correctly and simultaneously to make that movement possible. They had all, at various points in the war, waited for supplies that did not come. Ammunition trains delayed. Fuel convoys ambushed. Replacement parts lost somewhere in the administrative labyrinth of Wehrmacht supply chains stretched across a continent. They understood, from personal and bitter experience, how difficult it was to move things at scale. America was not finding it difficult. The darkness brought no relief from the spectacle. As night fell, the industrial landscape did not dim or quiet down. It simply transformed. The smoke became invisible against the black sky, but the fires did not. Every steel complex, every blast furnace, every gas flare became a point of light, and there were so many of them, stretching in every direction, that the industrial corridor the train was moving through looked from a distance like a city of stars that had descended to Earth and decided to stay. The reflection of furnace light on low cloud cover turned the sky above the mills a deep, restless amber that pulsed with the rhythm of the operations below. Fritz, the corporal who had blamed the Italian allies for the Tunisian defeat, had not spoken in several hours. He sat with his arms folded and his chin down, and in the shifting light from the window his face looked older than it had in the morning. "They told us," he started, and then stopped. "Yes," Hans said. They did not need elaboration. They had all been told the same things in different classrooms and barracks and briefing rooms across Germany. America was morally weak. America was racially diluted. America was a nation of shopkeepers and jazz musicians, soft with prosperity, unwilling to sacrifice, incapable of the iron discipline that true warfare demanded. America had waited 2 years before joining the conflict because America was fundamentally not serious about anything that could not be turned into profit. But the blast furnaces ran through the night. The cranes did not stop. The trucks kept moving on the roads that ran alongside the rail lines, their headlights cutting through the industrial haze in steady, unbroken procession. "I saw photographs," Peter said quietly, "of Detroit before the war. They showed the automobile factories, the assembly lines, Ford's plant at River Rouge." He paused. "I did not understand what I was looking at. I thought I understood what I was looking at. Somewhere in Ohio, or perhaps Indiana, no one knew exactly where they were. Hans fell into a half-sleep against the window, and in that dim, hypnagogic state, he found himself thinking about his uncle in Chicago and those letters from before the war. "You cannot imagine it until you see it, Hans." That was what his uncle had written. You simply cannot imagine it. Hans had thought it was the sentiment of an immigrant desperate to justify his choice, a man talking himself into loving his adopted country by exaggerating its virtues. He had not, in the comfortable certainty of his youth and his education and his national pride, taken those words seriously. He was taking them seriously now. The train rolled on through the luminous dark of industrial America, and the men in the cars were quiet with the particular silence of people confronting the distance between what they believed and what is true. A silence that is not peaceful exactly, but is the necessary precondition for every genuine change in understanding. They were not yet broken men. They were not yet doubters. Most of them, not in any complete or conscious way. But the architecture of their certainty had developed. In the span of a single day's train journey, a series of deep structural cracks. The propaganda had given them an America made of words and newsreel images, a paper country, easily dismissed, easily defeated. The view from the train window was giving them the real one. And the real one, it turned out, did not burn. It forged. The sensors read everything. Every letter that left the camps passed through the hands of American intelligence officers, men with German language training, many of them Jewish immigrants who had fled Europe in the 1930s and now sat in quiet offices in Virginia and Maryland, reading the private thoughts of the soldiers who had driven them out. They were looking for military intelligence, for coded messages, for evidence of escape planning. What they found, increasingly, was something they had not quite expected. men in the process of thinking themselves to different conclusions. The letters were filed. The interrogation transcripts were typed and bound and distributed up the chain of command. And in that paper archive, preserved in the bureaucratic amber of wartime record-keeping, the inner life of the German prisoner experience was captured with an intimacy no historian of the front could have achieved. These were not the official thoughts of soldiers performing patriotism for an audience. These were the 2 a.m. thoughts, the thoughts that came when the lights went out in the barracks and a man lay on his back and the machinery of honest reckoning would not be quieted. They wrote them down, and the censors kept them, and now we can read them. The letters home began changing within weeks of arrival. In the first days after capture, a prisoner's letter was typically a document of reassurance, written as much to manage the writer's own fear as to comfort the recipient at home. I am well. I am being treated correctly. Do not worry. The formula was almost universal, crossing language and nationality, the ancient instinct to protect those who loved you from the full weight of what had happened. A soldier captured in Tunisia was, in the eyes of his family in Dusseldorf or Dresden or Stuttgart, a man in terrible danger. The letter said, "I am not in danger. I am here. I am whole." But as the weeks passed, and the reality of the camp settled into something permanent and daily, the letters began to carry more weight. Hans wrote to his mother in Munich in November 1943, 3 months after his arrival at a camp in Texas. The letter was 6 pages long. The censors noted it with a small red mark in the file, indicating unusual length. He described the camp in careful detail: the barracks, the exercise yard, the canteen where prisoners could purchase small items with the script the Americans issued as a form of camp currency. He described the food. "We eat better here than I ate in the last 6 months in Africa," which I realize will disturb you to read, but it is true. He described the American guards with a complicated mixture of puzzlement and reluctant admiration. And then, on the 5th page, in handwriting that the translator noted had become smaller and more compressed, as if the writer were trying to take up less space on the paper, he wrote, "Mutti, I have seen things on the journey here that I do not know how to explain in a letter, and perhaps cannot explain at all until I come home and can sit across from you at the kitchen table. I will only say this: I do not think the people who told us what America was had ever seen it themselves. I do not think they could have said what they said if they had. I am not a defeatist. I am not a traitor. I am a soldier who has been to a place and seen a thing. And the thing I saw does not fit inside the story I was given." The censor underlined the last sentence. In the margin, in pencil, someone had written a single word: significant. The interrogations were more direct, and the intelligence officers who conducted them were skilled at creating the conditions for honesty. They did not use force. That surprised many of the prisoners, who had been prepared by training and by the habits of imagination for something harsher. Instead, the American interrogators offered cigarettes and coffee and a quality of unhurried attention that was, in its own way, more disarming than any coercive technique. They asked questions that seemed almost philosophical. What did you think America would be like before you came here? What do you think now? When did your thinking change? Sergeant Kessler was interrogated in late October 1943 by a lieutenant named Weisberg, a name that told Kessler everything about the man's history, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. Weisberg was originally from Frankfurt. He had left in 1935. He spoke German with a Hessian accent that Kessler found oddly comforting, like hearing a voice from a world that had not yet been destroyed. The transcript of the interrogation ran to 11 pages. At one point, Weisberg asked Kessler what he thought about Germany's prospects in the war. Kessler was quiet for a long moment. The transcript notation reads, "Subject paused. approximately 45 seconds before responding. Then he said, "On the Eastern Front, we told ourselves we were losing because of the Russian winter and the endless manpower, that eventually the Soviets would run out of men and we would hold. I believed this for a long time. Then I was transferred to Africa, and in Africa I saw American equipment for the first time. Their trucks, their artillery, their aircraft. I thought, this is a problem, but it can be overcome. Then I was captured, and I came here, and I saw from a train window. I saw what I saw." He stopped again. Weisberg waited. "We cannot win," Kessler said finally. The transcript rendered it in 3 words, flat and declarative, not because of anything that will happen on a battlefield. The battlefield is already decided by what I saw from that train. I understand production. I understand what it means when a country can do what I watched them do. I understood it then, and I cannot un-understand it." Weisberg asked if he would be willing to repeat this to other prisoners. Kessler looked at him for a moment and then said, "You are going to try to use us, aren't you?" Weisberg said nothing. "Fine," Kessler said. "Yes, I will speak to them. Not for your reasons, for mine. Not every man arrived at the same place. The camps contained multitudes. And it would be dishonest to suggest that the experience of American industrial scale turned every German prisoner into a clear-eyed skeptic overnight. Human psychology does not work that cleanly. For every Kessler, quietly dismantling his certainties in a Texas interrogation room, there were men doubling down, insisting that what they had seen was exaggerated, that American production meant nothing against German will, that the Führer had a plan, that the secret weapons everyone whispered about would change everything. These men existed in the camps in a state of willful insulation. They gathered in groups, self-selecting for shared certainty, and they policed each other's doubts with a social vigilance that was, in its own way, a kind of fear made visible. To doubt was to imply that the sacrifice had been wrong, that the friends buried in the Russian steppe, the brothers lost at Stalingrad, the fathers who had given everything to the cause had given it to something that was, at its foundation, a lie. The psychological cost of that realization was, for many men, simply too high to pay. A prisoner named Georg, a committed party member from Hamburg who had served in the SS before being transferred to a regular infantry unit, wrote a letter in December 1943 that the censors flagged for different reasons than Kessler's. Where Kessler's letter suggested erosion, Georg suggested acceleration, a hardening of belief in inverse proportion to the evidence against it. "The Americans want us to be impressed by their factories," he wrote. "They drove us past them on purpose. It is a psychological trick. A nation of machines has no soul. We have what they can never buy." The censor who processed Georg's letter had also processed Kessler's. In the margin next to Georg's final line, in the same penciled handwriting, were 2 words, "convincing himself." Peter Hoffmann, the 19-year-old from Heidelberg, the former university student, did not write political letters. He wrote to his father, a history professor, in a tone that was almost academic, as if he were composing field notes from an unexpected research opportunity. His letter from January 1944 has been quoted in at least 3 historical studies of the prisoner of war experience. The relevant passage reads, "Father, I have been thinking about what you always said, that history is not made by ideas alone, but by the material conditions that make some ideas possible and others impossible. I did not fully understand this when I sat in your lecture hall. I understand it now. I have seen the material conditions of the other side, and they are extraordinary. Not extraordinary as in admirable, though they are that too, but extraordinary as in outside of the ordinary categories of what I thought was possible. I think about this every day. I think about what it means for everything I was taught was inevitable. I do not write this to alarm you. I write it because you are the only person I know who will understand what I am trying to say." His father never replied. Peter would not learn until after the war that his father had been arrested in 1944 for a remark made in a lecture and had died in Dachau in February 1945. But the letter survives. The father's silence does not erase what the son understood. Alone in a Texas barracks in the first weeks of a new year, writing by the light that came through the window. What they whispered in the barracks after lights out was less articulate than the letters, but more raw. The sounds of a prisoner camp at night have their own texture. The coughing, the shifting of bodies on bunks, the occasional voice that speaks in sleep in German, always in German, the language of unguarded dreams. And sometimes, in the gaps between these sounds, actual voices, actual words. Men talking in the dark, because the dark made honesty slightly less dangerous. Did you see the rails? How many rail lines there were? I counted 6 parallel tracks at one point. 6. In Essen, there are 2. 3 at the main junction. Silence. The steel alone. Just the steel they must use every month. Don't. What? Don't calculate it? I calculated it. Don't. Another silence. Longer. My brother's at the front. I know. He doesn't know any of this. No. Someone should tell him. No one answered that. The question of who should tell the men still fighting, still dying in the snow and in the mud for a cause that a train journey through Ohio had quietly, thoroughly, and irrevocably disproved, was not a question that had an answer. Not yet. Not from a barracks in Texas, 10,000 kilometers from the front. But they knew. In the careful letters, in the careful silences, in the 3-word sentences that said everything. We cannot win. They knew the knowing was its own kind of prison. And unlike the camps, this one had no wire, no guards, and no scheduled release date. The generals understood it in strategy rooms. The economists understood it in spreadsheets. The politicians understood it in the quiet, private moments they never discussed publicly. But the German prisoners understood it from a train window. And that is perhaps the most honest way it was ever understood. Not as an abstraction, but as a physical, undeniable sensory fact pressing itself against the glass. The war was already decided. It had been decided before most of the men who fought it had fired a single shot. In 1944, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Germany produced 39,000. And Germany, by European standards, was considered an industrial giant. America built 88,000 tanks and armored vehicles that year. It launched 50 aircraft carriers during the entire war, a figure so disproportionate that Japanese naval planners, upon hearing the projections in 1942, reportedly fell into silence. The Liberty Ship program, the mass production of cargo vessels using assembly line techniques borrowed directly from the automobile industry, was delivering a completed ocean-going ship every 42 days by 1941. By 1943, that figure had been compressed through relentless optimization to an average of 17 days. Henry Kaiser, who had never built a ship before the war, built 747 of them. These numbers were not secrets. They were published, broadcast, celebrated with the particular American enthusiasm for quantified achievement. But what made them strategically decisive was not merely their size. It was their systemic implication. Behind every aircraft and every ship and every tank was a supply chain of extraordinary depth. Rubber and aluminum and steel and copper, fuel and lubricants and replacement parts, food and medicine and clothing for the men who operated them. All of it flowing through a logistical network that had no meaningful vulnerability because it was based on a continental economy that no Axis power could touch. Germany's war economy, by contrast, was operating under conditions of permanent, worsening scarcity. Every major German offensive after 1942 was constrained not by the courage or competence of German soldiers, both of which were, by any objective measure, formidable, but by fuel, by ammunition reserves, by the replacement rate of aircraft that could not keep pace with losses, by ball bearings and tungsten and a dozen other critical inputs that had to be imported or synthesized at enormous cost, or simply done without. Kessler had understood this instinctively from the train window, with the pattern recognition of a veteran soldier who had watched supply convoys fail to arrive on the Eastern Front. He did not need the numbers. He had seen the thing itself. What American industrial mobilization represented, at its deepest level, was the application of a single revolutionary idea to the problem of warfare: the assembly line. Henry Ford had understood in the early 20th century that the bottleneck in any production system was not the skill of individual craftsmen, but the friction between steps. The time lost moving material, the inconsistency introduced by variation, the human limits of any single worker doing a complete job from start to finish. Break the job into components. Move the components to the workers rather than the workers to the components. Eliminate variation. Eliminate friction, and watch the output curve climb toward the vertical. Detroit had built cars this way for decades. When the war came, Detroit built war. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, was at full capacity, completing one bomber per hour. One four-engine long-range heavy bomber capable of carrying 8 tons of bombs to a target 1,000 miles away every 60 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week. German aircraft engineers, upon receiving intelligence assessments of Willow Run's output, reportedly questioned the accuracy of the figures. The figures were accurate, and the thing the German prisoners had felt from the train, that low structural hum of a continent in permanent production, was this: the physical sensation of an assembly line that was 10,000 miles wide and ran without interruption from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, drawing in raw materials at one end and producing the instruments of war at the other with a mechanical regularity that had no human analog. It was not an industry. It was a force of nature that had been domesticated and pointed at a problem. Germany had skilled workers and excellent engineers and a genuine industrial tradition. But what it did not have, what it could not have given its geography and its resource base and its fundamental strategic position, was scale. And in the war that the 20th century had made inevitable, scale was not one factor among many. Scale was the answer. History is not kind to those who are wrong, and it rarely pauses to credit those who recognize the truth early, at personal cost, without the comfort of hindsight. But the German prisoners who sat in those train cars in the autumn of 1943 and came to their quiet, devastating conclusions were not defeatists in any meaningful sense of that word. They were realists. They were men who had set aside, at considerable psychological expense, the comforting narrative they had been given and looked at the evidence in front of them with honest eyes. They were right. The war in Europe ended on May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally after a final year of fighting that consumed the last of its reserves, its fuel, its ammunition, its aircraft, its trained pilots, its experienced officers, and finally its cities and its will, in the defense of a position that had been, in the strategic sense, lost since the moment the first Liberty ship left its dock and the first Willow Run bomber rolled off its line. The soldiers who died in that final year died for time, not victory, time that produced no change in the fundamental equation, time that the assembly lines of Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania continued, without interruption or mercy, to consume. Hans Brenner spent the last months of the war in a camp in Texas, working on a farm detail, picking cotton in the autumn heat. he said later, in a memoir fragment that was never published. Found among his papers after his death in 1987, that the work was hard and the sun was merciless, but that he found something like peace in the physical labor. The farm was enormous by German standards. The equipment was new. The farmer who supervised them was a laconic man from Oklahoma who treated the prisoners with a brisk, impersonal fairness that Hans came to respect. One afternoon, the farmer's radio, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse 100 meters away, carried news of a German city being bombed. Hans could not hear the details from the field. He kept working. He thought of his mother in Munich, of the destroyed wall, of the white sheets on the line behind the yellow house he had seen from the train in what felt like another lifetime. He thought of the letter he had written in November. The thing I saw does not fit inside the story I was given. He had been right. The story had been wrong. And he was alive in Texas, in the sun, which was more than could be said for too many of the men who had believed the story to the end. There is a particular weight to being right about a terrible thing. It carries no triumph, only the quiet, melancholy knowledge that the terrible thing happened anyway, and that being right did not stop it. The German prisoners who understood, from train windows and interrogation rooms and letters that passed through censors' hands, that Germany could not win against the productive capacity of the United States. They were right. They were right early. Their rightness saved no one. What it does, viewed from 80 years of distance, is serve as a kind of testimony, not to American superiority in any simple national sense, but to the nature of modern industrial war itself, a form of conflict in which the decisive battles are fought not on fields, but in factories, not by generals, but by engineers, not over years, but over decades of accumulated economic choice. The United States did not defeat Germany in 1945. It defeated Germany in 1913, when Ford opened the Highland Park plant and demonstrated to a watching world what an assembly line could do. The war was merely the occasion on which that fact became impossible to ignore. The prisoners in the train cars understood this with the clarity that only direct experience can produce. They had no graphs, no economic models, no strategic assessments. They had a window, and the American night beyond it, burning orange with the fires of a production system that never slept. That was enough. And that, it turned out, was everything. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment with your thoughts, and support with a like, and subscribe for more stories told this way.